Hello everyone, today we talk about the European spread of the Decretum Gratiani, the most important um, canon and decretal collection in medieval history, and therefore vital source and main point of reference for all canonists in medieval Europe, composed in the early 12th century by this Italian clergyman who this is a bit of a mysterious figure, it's not particularly documented, but that is basically quoted extensively in all, as you will see, all these in fact commentaries on the same Decretum, on the studies that flourished from it all over Europe, right? And manuscripts of the Decretum began immediately to spread, not just in Italy, but in France, England, Germany. And in France, the knowledge of Gratian's text is witnessed very early, perhaps the earliest outside of Italy, by the Collectio Caesara Augustana, that is preserved by the manuscript Latin 3876 of the Bibliothèque Nationale of Paris, and that was composed probably in Occitania, or even in Catalonia. We don't know exactly, but we've seen how the two regions were connected historically: southwestern France, northeastern Spain, and this occurred in as early as 1144. Right, the Decretum had been ended to be drafted, I think, like in 1139, something like that. So that tells you how close the contact was properly between the people that were, in this sense, jurists that were already that connected and intertwined by such an early date in Europe. And we made several videos explaining how this went much further than that, right? With lots of authors properly traveling from everywhere, from France, from Italy, even from Central Europe, in places like Spain, even Muslim Spain, right, to visit the libraries of the Muslim powers that pullulated with older texts of different type. In this case, we have a juridical collection emerged fundamentally from the same Western sources, right? The Decretum used a select amount of sources were properly Western, but there is a lot, even from Isidore of Seville, from a lot of different authors of previous times that, philologically speaking, were to be studied and in fact, researched proper through such enormous, in fact, inquiry and collection of texts that is properly symptomatic of Western Europe, right? The idea that, of course, the Arabs brought in Spain all these material is, however, to be understood in the influence in Western Europe, probably with the fact that Western Europeans went there appositely, right? So it was not a passive exposure, but actually an active one that, especially in the case of Italy, went beyond, right? We've seen it in other videos about, for example, the Justinian tradition that at this point was spreading, as you know, in civilistic studies through the reconstruction of the Corpus Juris Civilis, that was primarily connected with manuscript traditions that were unitly connected to, in fact, to the broader Mediterranean context. We find them in Pisa, in certain maritime republics that were connected with the Byzantine Empire, with the Muslim world, etc. So this connections are crucial to give properly a dimension of how rapid the spread of scientific knowledge of education was in Western Europe actively at the time, and with a degree of, of in fact, of dynamism that is not to be found at this point in any other place. And autonomous by individuals, by freemen, by this case lawyers, by merchants, by everybody that had here we're talking about canon law, so something that mostly pertained to ecclesiastical studies, but not only, because the Decretum Gratiani is, in a way, the in fact, the ecclesiastical parallel to secular civil law, fundamentally, that was being, in fact, reconstructed, as we've just said, with the recovery of Roman law, for practical purposes, not because it was specifically the Roman one, but because the common law that still dominated needed to fill its gaps by referencing to a more systematic, in fact, law that the Roman one provided exactly with. So canon law and civil law, as we will see now, here were connected, and common law at that, for that matter, as well, so that these clergymen were in a way the same individuals who had, as we have seen for the recovery of Roman law, actually being mostly the cause of the latter, meaning that, as we've explained in other videos, the recovery of Roman law passed essentially through the struggle for investitures, through essentially ecclesiastical issues with regarding the prerogatives of the emperor and the papacy and so on. So this eventually poured into, from in the secular world, that are still maintained a connection with the ecclesiastical one, juridically wise, because they looked at each other and how they were organizing their respective juridical systems and developing properly scientifically, philosophically, in parallel. To Occitania belong also the work Quoniam Egestas, that was instead drafted in Provence around the mid-12th century, and the 294 chapters collection of the manuscript of the University of Prague 8H7 that was drafted during the pontificate of Hadrian IV, who was between 1154 and 1158. That is one of those popes that, as we were saying before, were also heavily involved, just in fact, in the relation with the Holy Roman Emperor and the struggles with the Lombard League, etc. So exactly the places where Roman law had essentially flourished and that were so politically connected to this whole thing. And this latter collection was drafted in the Rhone Valley, we don't know exactly where, and in Orléans. Furthermore, after 1160, Etienne de Tournois, once having concluded the studies of canon law in Bologna, composed his very famous Summa to the Decretum. So even in here we have essentially a French connection, both essentially French and Occitan, with northern Italy, and with the studies that had produced there, both Roman and canon law, and a very close connection between these two regions. In fact, it's mostly Occitania, that we have seen also in other videos, that hosted, we don't know precisely where, the first, let's call it French, meaning Transalpine rather, of canon law. But in fact, this was first among the canon schools outside of Italy, right? And this precocity, let's say, that historians explain with the intense relations, especially economical ones, established around the mid-12th century, in between the cities properly of Occitania and the Italian communes, but also the important intellectual interests of the regular clergy of those regions that, as we have seen also in the video we made recently about Occitania, were pretty much interested in developing a kind of an autonomy from the Roman model in a sense, but essentially copying it, and how the thing ended, but also the similarity between properly southern France and central northern Italy in terms of urbanization. Wealth was the reason for let's say, the similarity, probably, of interests that existed at the time. Remember that these legal studies were functional primarily to, essentially, to an economical purpose, right? Not only, right, this went naturally in parallel with the theological interests, with the political ones, but, let's say, more dynamic communities, from economically wise, socially wise, were to regulate more promptly their own, in fact, their own law, their own system. So this necessity of elaborating a juridical science, right, and developing it further according to their own needs, was surely more advanced than in other regions. I mean, it's not a surprise, for that matter, that, I don't know, northern France was the cradle of theological studies, because of the ideological nature that the monarchy had, that was reflected in the hierarchical structure and so on, and that juridical studies were more developed in a place like Bologna, in communal civilization, and so in places that were much more active, commercially, financially, and so on. And however, as we know, southern France didn't quite take off in a statal sense. Eventually, they were taken over by the northern French later on. But the Occitane school of canon law didn't last long, in proper by itself, given that in the works that is attributed to it, there is not properly a hint to the Decretal's collections drafted, as we will see now, after the Decretum, right? So they basically took the Decretum, but they didn't update themselves, apparently, in a structural, systematic way, so to leave some further proof of such real aberration for the later the expansions, right? Of on the same Decretum, right? And this happened naturally because southern France was not quite as thriving as central northern Italy as such, right? In fact, the end of the canon of this school, we don't know the location of exactly, as being associated with the end of the studium of civil law that had been started by the Bolognese glossarist Placentinus at Montpellier, right? That later on would have become a great, kind of university center still today, but that reflects still here fundamentally an Italian that had gone teaching there, just civil law, and you can immediately understand how connected, in this sense, canon law was. The Placentinus school was was ended around 1170, right, at the death of the master, that is normally dated to 1190, in 92, but it probably was also up to the early 13th century. So what actually happened is that the end of the studium of Montpellier would have, let's say, taken away from Occitania the intellectual and didactic support of the civilists, that essentially the most credited holders of juridical science at the time, because naturally canon law was, let's say, not as was operating through different channels than civil law, that, as we've seen, was associated to a culture that in a way was more, let's say, more dynamically spread, even properly in terms of amount of people, right? Lots of lawyers now that were booming elsewhere. They properly, some regions of Europe, if you take Tuscany, they would grow to make up even a consistent part properly of the population. It's almost a demographic thing. And whereas canon law was still framed within ecclesiastical structure, so something that was surely evolving and developing rapidly at this point, but let's say it was still somewhat more elite in nature and or more mediated and let's say not so in fact not so for this very reason kind of more contained in its innovation, in its originality. And that's why also the Decretum was so successful in so many ways, because it also reflected there the, if you want an exception of the recomposition of a broader in fact of all these canons and decretals that existed, never had a systematic collection or that would be able to frame them in kind of a scientific way. This was for the first time the base, right? And it's not to be surprised again that this happened essentially in the same city, Bologna, where the same civil law had been developed. So there were certain mental structures, categories, scientific culture that had rendered it possible properly as a work scientifically in the first place, which is not to be found really elsewhere in the same fashion. Well, in the 60s of the 12th century, from let's say the 6th 12th century onwards, it was a new canon law school started in Paris, where the important studium of theology, the most important, frankly, to become, was already active. And so even there the connection is evident. And the vitality of the Parisian school is witnessed by the numerous summae that were attributed to it. For example, the Elegantius in Jure Divino, or Summa Coloniensis, was drafted in Cologne, Germany, around 1169 by a clergyman who had studied both in Bologna and in Paris. The Summa Parisiensis of around 1170, the Imperatoria Majestati or Summa Monacensis, that is later to the previous date, the Wide Omnes Qui Juste or Summa Lipsiensis, datable around 1186, the Ecce Vicit Leo of the first years of the 12th century, the Animal Est Substantia or Summa Bambergensis, the most extended of the French Summa to the Decretum, that is rich in reference to Justinian law, and that can be attributed to the years 1207, 1210, right? And these Summa are, distinguishable both for the influence of the theological reflection and juridical analysis and the influence of the teaching of Uguccio from Pisa, another important theorist in the field, and for the very meaningful use of the same Roman law, right? So showing, as we were saying now, that the permeation of naturally of canon law to properly Roman law, that considered was somewhat antagonistic in principle, meaning that the Roman law was traditionally associated to, in fact, civilistics, and in this regard mostly with secular power, so much that the same Holy Roman Emperor had, as you know, with the Constitutio Habitat, dramatically endowed the Bolognese jurists with prerogatives, with privileges, so much that they could produce more and more of that, because of the obvious reason that Roman law contemplated the subordination of the papacy to the empire, right? As in Byzantine culture, at the time of the Theodosian and eventually Justinian code. So if Roman law had taken over effectively over common law, and this this kind of superior and kind of all universalistic and perpetua sancta, as it was called in the late Roman Empire, that would essentially control the world, and this was, as you understood, being attempted not just with theoretical, but with ideal, but also with material means at the time, quite quite troubled ones, militarily speaking. Could have brought the church on the de jure, right, under the imperial control. So this is so interesting because it's not. I mean, that canonists would of course study Roman law and draw from it, right? Because as for the civilists, its categories were very useful. So was to organize the same ecclesiastical law. So the and the same thing is reflected, I don't know, philosophically speaking, at some levels. Think about the study of Aristotle, that was considered, an heresy. That's basically that would take place exactly in the theological study of Paris, where essentially the intelligentsia of Europe was studying religiously wise, and that therefore was very interested in philosophy and this new ideas that provided, but essentially was Avicenna rather than Aristotle at that point, but still this systematic Hellenistic Arab system of philosophy that eventually was the church could not stop in Europe, so much that it was actually integrated profitably by scholastics and the enormous work of Thomas Aquinas and other some of the greatest thinkers in medieval civilization, properly also drawing there an important, starting an important trend that is essentially a science-based, in fact, philosophy rather than essentially an ascetic one like the Neoplatonic that had essentially existed in Europe since the early Middle Ages, since the time of Saint Augustine, as a standard, right, of properly of Christian cultural reference. So this ambivalence we'll see now will also play importantly, even for the end of the same canon laws of the canon laws studies in some areas. And besides the Summe to the Decretum, there are also some collection of distinctiones by the Parisian school, such as the one titled Distinctiones Monacenses, composed after 1170, and the Speculum Juris Canonici. That is a collection of distinctiones composed around 1180 in Chartres by the canonist Pierre de Blois the Younger. Then also Questiones collections. We remember the Questiones Bambergenses, Questiones Andegavenses, the Laudunenses, the Londinenses. So here you see basically all the names in Latin of the area where they were either drafted or eventually found in manuscript tradition. The Summa Questionem Circa Jus Naturale by Richard de Morin, that was an Englishman, composed before 1187, and also the works dedicated to procedural problems such as the Ordo Judiciarius, drafted around 1171 in either Amiens or Rheims, the Ordo of Pierre de Blois, an anonymous Ordo written around 1170, the Ordo Bambergensis, datable to 1182-85, the Practica Legum et Decretorum from the Norman Guillaume de Longchamp, and finally an apparatus to the Decretum composed by a French master shortly after, the very beginning of the 13th century. So the works of the Parisian school have a specific, profile. First of all, the anonymate of the majority of its authors. There are some names here and there or figures, in fact, still anonymous, but that became more important. Aside from the jurists we mentioned before in the manuscripts, Petrus Brito, the Magister A, and Pierre Peverel. And also for the frequent quotes of the Bolognese canonists, right, that are to be found, especially in the first part of the period, while starting from the end of the 12th century, there is an increase of the direct quotes straight from either the Justinian collections and the civilist glossarists. So you can hear actually an ever closer civilistic character of the let's say the canonist culture at this point. There is naturally also in Paris unavoidably the very strong connection with the philosophical and theological reflection that that of course are not to be found among the ones of the Bolognese masters, the texts of Bolognese masters that are prerogative of the Parisian texts, and the quotes, the references to the Justinian texts becoming more important from the end of the 12th century, which just said, witness, especially a methodological address, right, that followed in this period from the Parisian canonists that saw the Justinian collection as a very technically elevated, point of reference on which the jurists had to found their own education, in particular in order to understand the meaning of the juridical terms. But also they drew from the Bolognese civilistic science the methodological model to follow the interpretation of the juridical texts, which are two different things naturally, receiving thus both the dialectical minds, let's say, of of the pro and contra that was adopted by the glossarists, and the commitment in the analysis of the meaning of the juridical terms, and also, however, to sustain the necessity of sustaining every argument with the properly the reference to a text provided with auctoritas, that naturally in the Middle Ages, especially at this time, was a big deal, and that in a more, let's say, theoretically oriented background like the French one was definitely, and also probably, as we say, also politically oriented, is with an idea of hierarchy of command, if you want, that very, very crucial. Also, the Parisian canonists avail themselves directly of Roman law and of its reading from the side of glossarists, not only to spot the solution to a problem that the canon norms were not able to solve, but also in order to operate a comparison with the Decretum. So in this activity, they actually behave with a interpretative freedom that was certainly superior to the one used by the Bolognese civilists, that were somewhat more mechanical and more practically oriented in a sense. So this is also relevant because, as we were just saying before, there was always a dialogue between canon and civil law. And such attention for civilistic science had to solicit the Parisian canonist masters to dedicate a growing importance to the learning of the Justinian texts. And it is within the situation that the bulla, the papal bulla Super Speculum, intervened. So this was issued in 1219 by Pope Honorius III, that actually forbade the teaching of Roman law in Paris. And historiography wondered why this would happen. Right, initially it was believed that such bull fundamentally would have been a sort of papal intervention to to break the French king Philip II Augustus' opposition to the spread of Roman law in France, essentially um, motivated by the fear that the spread of Roman law in his country would have somewhat brought a sort of imperial penetration in French affairs. This is an interpretation which didn't quite make sense, right? And the bull has been seen rather now as an exclusively papal provision that was aimed to essentially discipline uh, the Parisian clergy, right? As the Pope was worried for what was happening in the Parisian studium, where um, the, the students, but in general also the teachers, in growing number preferred to the study of theology and of canon law, the one of civil law, right? That was opening the chances of a much more, profitable business for them. And this is, quite eloquent, because it's essentially the revelation of the impact of civil law in properly in the Europe of the time for the, as we've seen, the practical, transactional, negotiational, legal expertise that was required in order to make business work more than else. So the Pope was worried that the Parisians were not just studying theology and canon law as clergymen that should have done, but fundamentally, just as that would have been an excuse of civil law. That's why before we were talking about Aristotle, because it's a bit the same thing, right? They were there to study theology, would have studied everything but that, but getting interested in other stuff. That naturally they found people that were willing to pay them for, in order to be taught. That's exactly how civil law had been born. In Italy, we've seen it, right? These were often, lay or even clergy, and that had started to, to provide privately some. That's how universities were born in the first place. Some education in juridical studies, but that society was very different, because the clergy still was already, if you want, framed within some administrative needs, also for the sake of saying ecclesiastical government. The lay jurists were essentially operating at the secular level that was there quite delicately, surely at some point opposed to the same episcopal rule in some cities, etc. But it was something unstoppable, because the entire community was somewhat versed towards this greater, let's say, juridical legal receptivity. As we've seen, most for economical reasons, they were more literate. They were simply another society. In a studium like the one of Paris was completely different. That was embodying the theological center of Europe, and these people had started studying something else, would have been pretty serious in practice, and would have also essentially produced a collapse in the quality of theological teaching, etc. So probably Philip Augustus had nothing to do with this, right? He was, even though Roman law, yes, was somewhat supporting the Holy Roman Imperial cause at some levels, but internationally was just, the King of France was not really opposed to the spread of it in the country. On the contrary, he was, especially by that point, where the French were, as you know, Germany here was, in the beginning of the 13th century, was going down. France was going up. At the end of the century, they thought they were the new emperors, right? So actually, Roman law would have been functional for them as well. This may be actually, I've never heard of this historiographical interpretation, but it may be as well that the Pope was not particularly happy of civil law spreading, maybe in a country like France more than one else, for the use that the monarchs could have done of it in relation to the same church, right? But it's possible too that the King of France was concerned equally to maintain certain educational standards of theology in the at that point de facto the capital of the kingdom, and one of the most important cities in Europe in the first place. So it's like it depends. Surely Paris was a lot of things, but surely the theological element was quite prominent traditionally, and it was important to maintain it. So in any case, after the bulla super speculum in 2019, the Parisian canon school began to decline as well, right? And the crisis was the effect of doubts and perplexities that within the French church specifically was posed by the new law of the Decretals, and so specifically the fact that the Pope could at that point issue, in fact, some new laws that would be enforced, right, in canon law, and that were naturally aimed at that point. That the church was the peak of its power, right, historically all over Europe. So, interfere too much with properly the French church, and this may have been, in fact, yet another reason why the properly also the monarchy was okay with the decline of canon law specifically, right? But this is because of papal interference, so rather than imperial one, and at that point wasn't quite strong anymore, like in the previous century. So it's not to exclude that, as it had happened in Occitania, the disappearance, the fall of the civilistic science had contributed to the decay also of canon school in the first place. So that essentially the papal interference there with the forbidding Roman law to be studied simply undermined the same interest towards canon law in the first place, because at that point it remained just, as we were saying, a political tool for the papacy to control better the French church and interfere in French politics, broadly speaking. And this, I think, altogether is a good explanation. Now, there is also another important current in the starting from the 12th century. It's called the Anglo-Norman one of canon law, right? And this is properly Anglo-Norman in the measure in which it was properly across the channel between England and Normandy. That here you understand what was the political deal, but it's important also to stress that Normandy was, of course, still within France and was influenced by what was happening in Paris at the same time. And in fact, the Anglo-Norman school of canon law stems not much from the Bolognese one as an independent thing, but rather from the French one proper, right? And the first works of the school were Summe, just like in France, and they began starting from the 60s of the 12th century. The oldest one, I believe, I'm not sure if others had existed before, but is the De Multiplici Juris Divisione, composed between 1160 and 1170, that was in fact it was based on the Summa by Etienne de Tournai, while particularly articulated was the Omnis Qui Juste of the 80s of the 12th century. And among the most famous masters of this school, there is Gérard Lapucelle, who was born in England, actually, and active both, in fact, in Britain, in France, in Germany, right? So, also Honorius, to whom is attributed the Summa Decretalium Questionum, right, in which he distinguished on the base of Bolognese mindset, let's say, the questiones in decretales or legittime, that referred to the interpretation of normative passages and were born out of the reflection of the doctrine, and the disputate that had to deal, they regarded some concrete cases that were born out of the school proper, the practice. Also Thomas of Marlborough. And the most important center of the Anglo-Norman school seems to have been Oxford, but it was somewhat more, fragmented in other centers. In fact, for some time, the studia of Exeter, Lincoln, and Northampton were active in canon law. And however, also this school kind of died out during the 13th century. Interestingly enough, by that time, the best English canonists transferred themselves to Bologna, right? So it's quite eloquent. And finally, there is to point out during the 60s and the 70s of the 12th century, many works of canon law were composed in Germany, mostly in colonial, or in its surroundings. The influence was mostly Anglo-Norman at that point, because you know that Cologne through the Rhine was just normally connected mostly to the North Sea traffics, to in general northern Germany. I mean, the Rhineland was a bit something on its own, but in general the northern part of Germany was also politically more aligned with England in kind of in different international matters. They received mostly that influence. We already remembered some of these works. For example, the Summa Elegantius in Jure Divino, also known as Summa Coloniensis, in fact, from Cologne, the Distinctiones Monacensis, and also a short treatise of processual law. The first words, which are Actenus Magister Gratianus, Egit de Personas. And in Cologne lived from 1165-66 to 68 Gérard Lapoussel, and we already mentioned, so he was active in Cologne, surely influencing the canon law there. And in fact, he taught there through especially the Summa Antiquitate et Tempore and the Notule super libello de significationibus verborum. Right? These are all Latin names. I'm not translating you, but these are small notes over the booklet about the meaning of the words. Right? So that's kind of the exegetically what they were looking at. Because yes, it was a big deal. Just they were eviscerating all the meaning framed within the juridical system, and you understand why canon law, civil law were so deeply connected at that point. Because again, we're always mirroring one another. So if for some time in Cologne, a center of studying of canon law was ever active, this had to be either of French or possibly more probably Anglo-Norman derivation, and not of the Bolognese type. So Germany was mostly derivative in this sense, but of course some connections with Italy existed. It's just that they were receiving it mostly from a mediated source. So that's what fundamentally makes and today I made this video, by the way, realizing that we never talked about the Decretum Gratiani, but we'll have to do it. There are many topics relative to that, notably the decretal collections after the Decretum that were ever more that reflect mostly papal policy, as you understand, as they were essentially what the popes were issuing by such decreta, essentially, and that were ever more systematized, and eventually they gave birth to so essentially to this jurisprudence based on themselves and on their categorization, their studying. Something went on for centuries, right? So we'll see it another time, but we have to talk about canon law because it is a bit overlooked also in its qualitative, in its civilizational impact, as we've seen, even though civil law had almost, always it's kind of the greatest impact altogether but mostly in civil affairs. So we tend to underestimate how much instead was in the sense, they affected canon law, but also how much canon law by itself, in its particular nature, was influenced civil law as well. So for today, I stop it here. For now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.